In my analysis, and leaving aside the impotence of the regimes of the existing Arab order, there are three political realities to be faced. The first is that Zionism's in Israel leaders are not interested in peace on terms virtually all Palestinians and most other Arabs and Muslims everywhere could accept. They never were interested in the past, they are not interested today, and they never will be interested in the future. The second is that only an American president has the leverage required to cause, or to try to cause, enough Israelis to be serious about peace on the basis of an acceptable amount of justice for the Palestinians. Yes, it's true that the leaders and governments of other major powers, and as Europe has been mentioned, they have leverage, but they won't even think of using it until America gives the lead. The third political reality we face is this: no American president is ever going to use the leverage he has until he is pushed to do so by informed public opinion, by expressions of real democracy in action. In other words, for peace to have a real, and I personally believe very last chance, a constituency of understanding has got to be created here in America to enable the president to break the Zionist lobby's stranglehold on Congress. As I put it in the epilogue to the forthcoming volume 3 of my book, in order to use the leverage he has to require Israel to be serious about peace, the president needs enough members of Congress to be more frightened of offending their voters than offending the Zionist lobby in all of its manifestations. Now, as I dare to suggest in my Dear America introduction to volume 1 of my book, the problem here in America is that most Americans are too uninformed and misinformed to do the pushing and make their democracy work. Simply stated, most Americans, like most Westerners, have been conditioned to accept a version of history, Zionism's version, which is not true. It is quite simply a pack of propaganda lies from beginning to end. Now, the biggest of all these lies is, of course, the assertion that poor little Israel has lived in constant danger of annihilation, the driving into the sea of its Jews. As I document in great detail throughout the 3 volumes of my book, Israel's existence has never, ever been in danger from any combination of Arab force. Not in 1948, not in 1967, not even in 1973. Despite some stupid Arab rhetoric that suggested otherwise and assisted Zionism to get away with this mother and father of all lies, the Arab regimes never had any intention of fighting Israel to liberate Palestine. Zionism's assertion to the contrary was the cover that allowed Israel to get away where it mattered most, here in America and Europe, with presenting its aggression as self-defense, and itself as the victim, when actually it was the oppressor. I bring the prologue to volume 1 of my book to an end by quoting the Israeli I most admire. He is Major General Shlomo Gazit. He was the best and the brightest of Israel's directors of military intelligence. And when I was doing some secret shuttle diplomacy between Arafat and Peres, he was the one advising Peres. Over coffee one morning, I said to Shlomo, I've come to the conclusion that it's all a myth. Israel's existence has never, ever been in danger. He was stirring his coffee, and he stopped in mid-stir, and he looked at me, and through a very sad smile, he said, quote, "Alan, the trouble with us Israelis is that we become victims of our own propaganda." Now, the biggest of all these supporting Zionist propaganda lies is that Israel had no Arab partners for peace. I've already said, and you know, that Arafat had prepared the ground on his side for peace by the end of 1979. But there were a number of Arab overtures for peace long before that, and I'll mention just one. In 1951, within a very short time of coming to power, President Nasser of Egypt wanted an accommodation with Israel. So much so that he had secret exchanges with Israel's then Foreign Minister, Moshe Sharet. It was because Sharet wanted to be serious about advancing a peace process with Nasser that he was destroyed by Ben-Gurion. The documented record is quite clear. It was Israel's leaders, not the Arabs, who spurned opportunity after opportunity to make peace. Now to what I believe is the real significance of the truth of history as it relates to the making and sustaining of the conflict in and over Palestine that became Israel. The key, repeat, the key to creating the constituency of understanding needed here in America to create the space to enable a president to break the Zionist lobby's stranglehold on Congress is the truth of history. Put another way, it's only when enough Americans are informed about the truth of history that there will be, perhaps I should say could be, sufficient pressure on Congress for an end to support for Israel, right or wrong. Question: why is it still today that most Americans are ignorant of the truth of history? A large part of the answer is that the mainstream media still prefers to peddle Zionist propaganda. It's that simple. But in my view, the ignorance is also evidence of the failure of activist groups of all faiths and none. Yes, it's important to draw attention to what's happening in Israel and Palestine today, and to protest Israel's violations of human rights and international law. Yes, it's important to assist the oppressed and occupied Palestinians to remain steadfast and go on surviving. And yes, it's important to campaign for boycott, divestment and sanctions. But none of this is going to result in a fundamental change of US policy, so long as most Americans remain ignorant of the truth of history and how much they have been conned by Zionist propaganda. The conclusion invited, or so I believe, is this: it's time for activist groups to give priority to devising and implementing a strategy for informing and educating Americans about the truth of history, and therefore who must do what and why for justice and peace. Because this is the only way there is a hope of having an end to the conflict, which is not catastrophe for us all. And by all, I don't just mean the Jews and the Arabs in the region. I mean all of us, everywhere in the world.